Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to the channel. My name is Paul Sinenko, and today we're talking to Demetrius Kelly, who's our in-house assets creator as well as DGlux engineer. So basically, he's the one of those rare dudes who can make his own assets and use them as well. So that's a quite a valuable skill, as his design work and his ability to model and render things is always in context of their usability within development environments like DGlux. So Demetrius and I have worked together for years now, and we've gone through quite a few iterations of all kinds of ideas and platforms and so on. So I'll let him basically say a few words about his own experience in DGLogik and now Qt, and then we'll move on to actually DGlux5. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. So I started doing, I guess, computer graphics back in college. I studied computer graphics and illustration. Um, so yes, I studied computer graphics in college going back to 2002. Um, so it was computer graphics and illustration. So I then actually moved to Japan. I did a lot of different odd jobs, um, a lot of which were a lot of freelance graphic jobs as well. Moved back to the States 2012, and I believe I started with DGLogik around maybe 2013, 14, I want to say, around there.
That sounds about right. That's about as far as my memory goes anyway. So, and I remember you at that time, around that time. Yeah. So first off the bat, coming from kind of various freelance work into environment where you're designing things and creating things for a specific development platform where they're used in a certain way, what are the major changes have you noticed? How did you have to adjust your skills or your outlook on things, basically to turn out things that are usable in that environment, in that context?
Yeah, so I completely had to figure out, I guess, the best way to optimize the actual end images because I was so used to um, doing high res, super high res things that, of course, the file sizes are huge. And, you know, DGLux being web based, I definitely had to kind of learn how to shrink things down and not get so detailed on certain things.
Yeah, I mean it's well, I mean nowadays this kind of asset weight battle is not maybe as critical anymore with the kind of network speeds being what they are. But you know, I guess depending on what industry you're making this for, you know, some areas that are going to remain nameless aren't exactly at the forefront of of technology, and sometimes you do have to deal with very slow modem connections and cellular connections on site, where you do want to really be mindful of asset size and weight and so on and so forth.
Definitely.
So, I mean, you do both 3D and 2D work and the combination thereof. What are your basically what are your personal feelings about kind of 3D versus 2D? And right now we're not talking about their usability within certain contexts, but in general, your own personal take on things. So like, do you like 3D modeling better, or do you like kind of stylized 2D graphics? What are your preferences internally?
Um, you know, my preference is more so in the 3D because it's a bit more versatile. Um, that's kind of the realm that I've been in for a while. So if I can make something look 2D-ish using 3D, I tend to do that. Um, just because I feel a little bit more comfortable with certain graphical things with as far as that's concerned. Um, that in combination, 2D does have its place, but for me, 3D is where it's at, basically.
I mean, 3D graphics, I think, I mean, my personal opinion on this. They look really well and they're really good when they're one-off. So they're when you create a very specific scenario, like a building and specific equipment, and it's all rendered together as one scene. I think the usefulness of 3D renderings within libraries, I feel like novelty of it is starting to wear off, right? This was really like the bee's knees, in the 2015, 2014, in those years where like 3D felt like a leap forward. Where, oh my God, I can see my children from all the sides, if I render and then when you try to actually work with those graphics, right, connect them and then structure them together into systems, you start really feeling drawbacks. So I mean, personally, I was always I can't say I'm a proponent of 2D graphics, but my preference has always been in the flat view of a 3D rendering, right? So that you get the depth effect with shadows and everything else, but without that three-quarter view where you see it from from the corner somewhere, because then it becomes really difficult to make these renderings work in other environments. Again, if you render like one whole system as one rendering, sure, everything is modeled and it's going to render perfectly. But when you render components that are meant to be put together in another environment, and they're supposed to basically click together and then create one coherent system, of course, it becomes quite a bit more difficult to produce a better looking and functioning system when you have the three-quarter views and so on. So this kind of brings us into the middle ground, the isometric stuff, or I think there was another name for it, but it doesn't come to my head right now. But what I'm talking about is where it's not a true 3D, where basically it's a geometry that would not be possible in real world, but yet it's a way to render something to make it actually kind of click with other objects in a on the same plane, so to say, in 3D space.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about that and what's involved in creating a graphic like that?
Right. So basically, with the isometric view, you're basically getting rid of all the vantage points, so to speak. So everything is like on a plane. So even though it appears 3D, it's really not. You are creating these things with 3D software and rendering them out. So the process is the same, but the way you set up your camera is different. Okay. So those particular things, once they're rendered and set up, they're easier to click together because they run parallel on a straight line. So that could definitely, as far as with making libraries and such, that would be a definite way to go if you're interested in doing 3D.
So, however, I think, well, isometric is a bit more than just lack of vanishing point. So what I mean is it's a perspective where you have two dimensions at 90 degrees to each other and then z dimension going backwards, right? So
Right.
basically an impossible combination of angles.
Yes.
So it's a lot of games, or a lot of old school games were made like this, right? Where you have these tiles that are kind of facing you perfectly, yet they have the kind of the z dimension going off at 45 degrees to the back. And I think I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong. To create something like this, you cannot create this in 3D environments like 3D Max or most of the software, right? You have to go and then doctor them in like Photoshop, where you literally have to skew renderings, right, to fix those angles. Is that am I right there?
So on certain things on objects and to an extent, yes. There's also no there is software out there that will create an isometric view for you. But depending upon the object, you might have to then go into Photoshop and mod it a little bit or shape it to
Well,
where
I just remember the duct work, right? Duct work, like back in the day, all right, making the ductwork basically have a 3D component to it, yet being flat on the plane so it connects nicely. Was I remember having like going in Photoshop, and after the rendering of the pieces is done, going to Photoshop and having to skew it a bit so that you end up with two 90-degree dimensions.
That's
Right.
what I'm talking about. Yeah. So, example, if I make a chiller, um, that chiller is not like actually, it's a chiller. It's not part of a puzzle piece, right? And this has to connect to a cooling tower. It's being connected by straight piping, right? Whereas the ductwork, it's like an interconnection of puzzle pieces,
Right, right,
right?
because you can't just slap another one anywhere. It has to basically, fully
Right. So
connect, right? Not in just
so
one spot.
with those, then yeah, you would have to go into and use additional software, example Photoshop, to kind of shape it to um, fit and do a lot of little tricks to get everything to work properly.
Let's move on. So when you okay, let's talk about accuracy of the rendering. This has always been my kind of pain point, because typically you find uh, clients and often the designers themselves, like the artists who model things, kind of trying to do very accurate, detailed model of whatever equipment they're working on, and it's often lost in kind of the fact that you're doing this for a library, right? Not for a very specific situation is often lost on the client. So they when they want a chiller, right? They try to model it or ask you to model a chiller with all the bells and whistles. However, when then library is being used later on, and he has to use it for to represent slightly different chiller, right? Then questions start. It's like where, oh, but my chiller has two compressors here, and yours has three, or mine has these valves in here, and yours doesn't, and so on and so forth, right? So to me, the great accuracy of the rendering when you deal with libraries, right? Again, we're not talking about one-off situations when you render something specific for a project and it reflects that project exactly. Those are special situations. When you talk about a library that's supposed to be reusable, right? Where do you land on this spectrum of stylizing versus kind of accurate rendering, and what's your take on the kind of drawbacks and benefits of each?
Right. So I only really deal with um, uh, completely accurate pieces if the customer requests them. If they don't, I try to make uh, things general. I tend to generalize things. So if you have a chiller and they don't know the specific model number of the chiller and they kind of don't care, I will make it look like a generic chiller, maybe stylize it a bit, as well as the animation because I don't know how big or small the 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 actual end piece is going to be. So to render something with all the lights and the all the pumps and everything, 100% accurate would be extremely lost and kind of irrelevant in most cases, especially if you're making it for a chiller plant. So it's going to end up being very small. Um, so I have had projects where clients were specifically, we have this model number cooling tower or this model number chiller. I need this specific thing. Um, and then, I'll go in, get the plans and make it, so to speak. But that does take a bit amount of time as well to accomplish that. And it's kind of a balance.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that many of those details kind of get lost in the scaling anyway is, I guess, is one thing. Again, my issue has always been, the more details you add, the more complaints you get later when those details don't match the field exactly.
This is
right?
why I
So
tend to keep things general.
right. So when building, so today, right? Today, my preference is not even a realistic representation of an equipment that I prefer. I really like stylized, almost cartoony representation, kind of icon, or I don't know if iconic is the right word, but basically more like an icon representing something rather than actual image of the equipment. Uh, Kind of does a better job at keeping everyone satisfied, right? First of all, it doesn't take too much attention away from the actual data, right? Because in the end, we have to be mindful of the fact that we're building this, right, to display important data, right, and to aid decision making. So your graphics, I don't think they should overpower the data you're trying to display, right?
Right.
And
Definitely not.
and in graphics with bunch of details, definitely crowd the screen to the point where it's difficult to pick things out. And also, like I said, I think the detailed 3D renderings are left somewhere in early kind of 20,
Well, I'll say this.
2012, 2015s, right?
Right.
This day and age, you're not going to surprise or wow anyone with a good looking 3D graphic, right? Going with photorealism is completely moot point in my view, because at that point, just get a photo, right? And and yeah, I think the well-made, stylized representation of an equipment would always be more useful than a detailed rendering of that same piece of equipment. But that's my view, right? And once I explain it to kind of prospective clientele, people tend to agree with that, right? But the gut initial kind of desire is like, oh yeah, I want details, a bunch of details. It's only when you start thinking about it, or I'm talking about clients here, when they start thinking about it, it's like, do I really want all those details and all those rivets and bolts on my graphics?
Right.
Because you know what, in most cases, no, not really. So anything you want to add to this? Because I know for some reason I end up
Sure.
talking the
Sure.
most through this.
Yeah. I mean, I totally believe that. Um, I tend to try and make things that fit the project at hand, right? So if the UI design calls for something to be a bit more um, detailed, then so be it. If the UI design tends to be a bit more iconic and more text driven, um, then of course I would the 3D needs to be subdued big time or pulled back. Um, but there's always going to be, I think, a place for it. Um, Not necessarily maybe in chiller plants, because those things can get extremely wild, especially with 3D. I've seen it time and time again, where I'm modeling a chiller plant, and it looks like a spider's nest of piping just everywhere, and you can't see anything, right?
Yeah.
Um, but I think if you want to go down deeper to each individual piece of equipment, maybe it has its place.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. Yeah, there's definitely a time and a place for eye candy. I don't think the place is in the library, right? So
Right.
what the distributable library, I think, is not a place for eye candy for the sake of eye candy, right?
Yes.
But when you talk about project specific renderings, yes, especially where I really like the details is the splash page, like building rendering, right? Like
Building an
solar
explore
system
plan
rendering, where
sometimes.
yeah, because almost every project has pages that are dedicated to the eye candy, that are meant to grab attention. They're often kiosk display pages, right? They're splash pages, and there you definitely, I think, want that eye candy, the detailness, and especially if you make that interactive. So when you have kind of high fidelity rendering with details, and then you add interactiveness in DGlux, then it really kind of brings it out and makes it kind of play really well into this. Wow factor. But yeah, once you get into more technical areas, yeah, I think the usability of that starts kind of going down exponentially. Right. Well, let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about systems, right? So rendering systems or building sets, right? So that has to do with piping, ducting, right? Other systems that are supposed to interconnect. What are your methods, right? Like describe your process. How do you like from the moment that you get a request, let's say internal request that we're looking for a new piping library, right? And some basic guidelines of why we need a new one versus the old one. So what's your process, right? The example scenario would be we need a new water pipe library for our next whatever version of the product.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The piping has to obviously be connectable, so you can build pipe systems and I don't know, maybe adjust color. What are your steps in the process? Where do you go first? Where do you go next? And then how do you execute this?
Sure. So first, you have to make a decision on, I usually make a decision whether if I'm going to use 2D or 3D with that. So, and what is the piping going to connect to? Is it going to connect to something that is 3D built in 3D modeling, or is it built in a 2D? Right. So let's say if you have this piping needs to connect to equipment that is 3D, right? But at the same time, it's piping, right? I'm not going to sit there and maybe render out pipes for it. So I'll probably end up making SVGs for that, or 2D. I will try and have a kind of 3D effect to it using a gradient. But with the SVG, it's easier to change colors and so on with that, as opposed to rendering out PNG files or image files, which you can't really change the color for. Um, so it's kind of like you have to decide what's your end goal. What is everything going to link to, and will it look almost seamless? Because that's you're also trying to make things look seamless as well.
Right. Well, that and also can reduce number of puzzle pieces that user has to use, right? But basically analyzing where you can make a stretchable piece, right? Or where you're gonna have to stay with a small, like when you talk about 90-degree corner, right? Those are, you can't really stretch that much. You just have to grab it and add it to a screen. But when you talk about, let's say, a vertical horizontal piece, there's no need to make the user, drop one after another just to make a longer piece, or, you can look into making them stretchable. And that, of course, gets involved in the figuring out how they should be stretched, right? Whether it has any graphical, anything rendered in that would hurt stretching, right? Whether
Right. So
gets
that's the other thing you do have to concern yourself when you're um, dealing with image files that you've rendered, is you have to make sure that if you're going to stretch something, that that piece needs to be seamless. So in other words, you're kind of making a seamless texture, in other words, because it has to replicate and duplicate itself over and over again. So if you have like one pixel that's there, it's that one pixel is just going to repeat and it's going to look extremely weird. So
we've seen those before, yes.
right.
Okay, so you made those decisions, you figured that out. What's next step? So you jump right into your 3D graphics tool, or do
So
you
if
do you
I'm
do any sort of
so if I'm going to make the piping in 3D, what's going to happen is I'm going to model um, basically if it's piping, I will model kind of like a square section of it. So you have basically your straight piece, your so your straight horizontal, your straight vertical, and then you have your end caps. And then with your end caps, I also make sections to replace with the L shapes. So you have your L shapes, your T's. If you need a cross section, I would add that in as well.
So you
Uh,
do that in 3D modeling
so I
software,
would do
or
that in the 3D modeling software. So
okay?
after that, I would actually put them, after I have the square, I would actually move them into the same exact space. Because what's next is the lighting part, right? So after you run your material, which is usually like a metal type material, um, you light it. So I usually put it in one space so they all have the same lighting, and then I'll render them out separately into their own separate image file.
And
For
I
example,
imagine you use a directional light, right? So you don't have a spotlight effect, so that everything gets lit.
so actually, with something like that, I actually use, depending upon what I'm doing, I will use two different softwares. So things like that, I tend to use a software called Keyshot, which is basically an HDR lighting thing. It's really simple. I don't have to sit there and kind of figure out this spotlight here and this and so on. I just throw it in, move the light to kind of a perpendicular thing, so it's just flat lighting, and then render it out. It saves a lot of time in rendering things like that.
Okay, so basically you model in 3D Studio Max, as I understand, and then you just export it to Keyshot to do your lighting and materials, or
Yes, for that particular instance.
gotcha.
So also too with maybe your basic equipment like chillers and so on, um, you can get really nice effects too, as far as um, um, if you want to make things look realistic. It has a bunch of material libraries already, so I don't have to worry about texture mapping. So I could just throw materials on different
So
parts.
how long does a library like that take? So, because I mean, I think everyone is more or less aware of what's inside a water piping library, right? So, like, your piping and then probably valves, right, and a few other objects that are part of that. How
Hmm.
long does a set like that take from from conception, right, of you getting down the request to make one to the deliverance? What is that lifetime of this project, the lifespan?
So just like for piping,
Let's
uh,
say yes, piping and associated things like sensors that go into pipes, valves that go into pipes, like not the equipment, right? Not the chillers or anything like that, but
right,
water
right. So yeah,
pipes
that's
and then
that's a whole other
accessories.
animal.
Yeah.
So like the piping and such really doesn't take so long, and maybe about uh, depending uh, 3 days to a week.
3 days. Sounds fair. Okay. All right. So let's switch gears and talk about clients a little bit. Now you don't get to always have direct access to the end client, but you do sometimes, right?
Yep.
It depends on the dynamics of the project. So in those cases where when you can talk to the client and then kind of have a on demand conversation about kind of to verify something or to get more details. Um, how do you manage a client basically? So if a client comes in saying, we want to develop these various libraries for our new product that we'll be coming out with, and obviously you're tasked with that job. Um, Explain your process of managing a client, right? How do you, because there'll always be some ideas that the client may have that are terrible, right? And you somehow need to communicate to them and so on. So explain your client management process. How do you address situations where you don't think client is going the right way? Right? What if they get a bit pushy? Like, what are your methods to kind of resist that, or do you tend to not to? Basically, how do you deal with various client-related situations?
So there have been times where clients have I had butt heads a little bit as far as some design ideas and so on. What I tend to do is I tend to make a sample of what they're talking about, throw it up and show them, and explain why I think this is not the way to go. Again, it's not like a full blown finished piece, but it's something that I tend to throw together just to kind of show how I think it should go. Usually after they see that, they usually tend to be like, oh, okay. And then kind of flip and change. If not, some I've had times where clients have won, and I kind of said, okay, we'll go this way. Um, so it really depends. I try to not bend over, but at the same time, so to speak. But at the same time, I tend to try and work with, because at the end of the day, it's their project. I'm just there to kind of make their vision a reality, so to speak. Um, I like to think that I tend to uh, try to put my work and myself into it a little bit, but at the end of the day, that's it. It's their show.
Yeah, after all, they pay, right? So they technically they can get whatever they want,
Yeah,
well, within the allotted funds. Yeah,
and the
but sometimes
time too.
so yeah, and I mean, we've all been there, right? And sometimes you just see that funds are not being kind of used in the most efficient way, and sometimes you can show and demonstrate that to the client, convince them, and sometimes you just can't. And there have been times, I'm sure in your career as well, where you're forced to do the wrong way, or at least the way your client wants, only to, when you're done, to finally demonstrate that this was not the right way to do it. And unfortunately,
Yes, a
at
few
that
times.
time, it's already been built. It's already been built and paid, right? But and sometimes you just have to go back saying, look, we've talked about this, and it's one of those bittersweet situations where you get vindicated on one hand. On the other hand, we don't want those situations where you have to
Yeah,
come back and ask for more funds to do it the right way next time. So
I try to avoid that, but sometimes it's unavoidable.
it happens. It happens. So kind of to wrap things up, if you wanted to say something to all the prospective clients out there to make their future orders as smooth, as painless as possible, when it comes to running and executing the project and getting what they need delivered. And I want to especially underline not what they want, but what they need. And there's usually a big gap between what they want and what they need.
Yeah.
What would you tell them? How would you describe your perfect project that would make things easier for them, for you, for timelines, and for budgets?
So you mean like what they're going to deliver to me to
Yeah,
make?
what do you expect from them, right?
Okay.
What kind of support you expect from them in interaction? What kind of non-interference you expect from them, right? So basically, like I said, if you had to describe your perfect project, how would you describe it?
Sure. So, with as far as things I get, so example, if we have a floor plan, um, I've gotten everything from little drawings on napkins to full blown AutoCAD files with the whole building attached just for a floor plan. Um, I don't,
Yeah,
I
those
don't,
with every outlet marked on it. You
yes.
know?
you know, I don't want that. Really, realistically, all I need is a PDF, a simple PDF. I don't need the electrical diagrams and all that. Just a PDF of the floor plan, depending upon um, the level of detail that you want.
And sorry to butt in there for a sec, but with CADs, I just that's one of well, it used to be my pain point is like people tend to think like the more detailed the CAD is, the easier it is for you to turn it into a
Yeah,
floor plan.
it's really not. It's really
You have to
not.
understand, but just to clean it up, like to
Uh,
the walls, right? Because what you need to make a floor plan is walls, basically.
that's
So
it.
yes, you can extrude a CAD, but to clean it up, right, from full detail level to just the wall, so you can extrude it, could be longer than drawing those walls from scratch.
Correct.
So
So
it's just I
all
just
I
need to
really
put
want is
that
the PDF, and I'll just draw the walls myself.
exactly.
I don't need to extrude your walls.
Exactly.
And that goes for anything. That goes for your chiller plants. That goes for your equipment diagrams. For your equipment, you know, I don't really need a diagram for that. I need the model number and the company that makes it. I'll Google it, find an image, and we'll make it. I don't need all of that other stuff. Um, that's my biggest pet peeve. The other thing is basically I do like input, um, but at the same time, let it cook, so to speak. I'm where I'm at for a reason. I know what I'm doing. So um, you know, let me be to my own devices. You'll come out with a good project.
Let me actually again. I'm going to butt in there because I think I can rephrase what you said.
Hmm.
Um, it's not. I don't think you're just not looking for any sort of input. I
No,
think
no, no,
what
no, no, no.
all of us are the kind of input that all of us are looking for, even me with development side and you in the graphics, is what are you trying to achieve with that, right? So we can figure out how do we need to do for you to achieve that, right? So the valuable input is how you're planning to use it, right? And where do you envision using it? Not necessarily how it should look and how to cut the pieces, right? Just
Hmm.
explain how and where you intend to use it. And in this case, Demetrius has years of experience to take that and from that figure out how to best cut it up, how to best render it, how to best basically make it so you can use it in a way you intend to use it. Right?
Like, do it? Do
That's
we
the kind of
actually?
input that's
Do
always
we
very
actually?
valuable.
Like, do we actually need graphics? Sometimes a table list is sometimes the best way to show something, right? So it really depends.
Yeah, it really depends. Like I said, not. I don't think there's a single professional out there that likes it when his clients start kind of giving him ideas how to do
Right.
this stuff. But I think at the same time, almost every professional out there would always want the input of, again, how the client is planning to use whatever he's asking you to build so that
Yeah.
you can make the best decisions using your expertise in the field for the client to make sure the product you're providing is best usable in those situations for the client. Great. Well, that brings us to the end, right in the queue. So appreciate sharing your wisdom here, and I
Thanks
know
for having me.
we're exchanging wisdom quite often between the two of us. But now this time you let the whole wide world peek into who Demetrius Kelly is and what he does. And
Mhm.
by the way, we didn't even get into the tattoo side of your career.
I
we'll
didn't know
we'll
if you
keep
wanted me
that
to talk about that.
we'll keep that for maybe for a part two at some point.
Yeah.
But there's that. Just so you know, there's more to Demetrius that meets the eye, or in this case, meets the webcam.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, thanks a lot, and I'm sure we'll talk again. And thanks everyone for tuning in.